Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats and welcome the moderator, Steve Clemons.
Everyone, we're going to get this show on the road here. I'm Steve Clemons. I'm founding editor-at-large of a new global media startup called Semafor. I'm a regular here at Bratislava Forum, and I feel like this is one of the great opportunities where we can have, really more intimacy and more exchange with some of the biggest ideas in the world and the biggest struggles. And today we're talking about both struggle and opportunity in thinking about Ukraine's bid for post-conflict security. I think we just heard President Ursula von der Leyen talk about what would be needed and how to achieve long-term security in Ukraine. And I think what we'd like to have here today is an open discussion of that. We're going to start with a chat, but I want to do this a little differently, and I'm going to begin going to people early. There's no reason. Almost everyone in this room could be in this panel, right, Ivo? I called on Ivo last night at the end. So get prepared and think about parts of the conversation and edges that we should be getting into. I think one of the fears I have in conversations is that everyone is going to think the same thing. I know that's not true in the panel we have here, but I hope that we'll have some diversity of thought and perspective in this room as well. So please welcome Olha Stefanishyna, Deputy Prime Minister for European and Euro-Atlantic Integration of Ukraine. Please welcome her to our stage. Žygis Pavilionis, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the Lithuanian Parliament. Tobias Ellwood, Chairman of the Defence Select Committee of the UK House of Commons, and Benjamin Haddad, Member of Parliament, National Assembly of the French Republic. Thank you so much for joining us. There we go, Ben. Let me start out here, and I should say, remind everybody, we have Slido, so feel free to, those of you watching online, send your questions in, and I will be monitoring it carefully and trying not to screw it up. So please feel free to send those questions in. Although it's now beeping at me, so we'll see what happens. Let me just start out, Olha, I know we were talking just a moment ago about some comments that were made yesterday, and of course we just heard President von der Leyen talk about things like bundling security guarantees and whatnot, and that yesterday you heard someone say that Ukraine's aspirations to become a member of NATO sparked this war. I know you'd like to respond to that.
Well, let's see. It was the Georgian Prime Minister, which makes this statement even more interesting, because otherwise it will be like some Russian official or sort of a Russian Pokemons, let's say, that would not even bring that issue to our attention. But just a bit more than a year ago, we had a competition in NATO headquarters with Georgia for aspiring to join NATO, and Georgia was far more advanced than Ukraine, I can assure you, because it's not the case anymore, but it was really classified information that Georgia was far more advanced in running for membership, probably because the war in Georgia started 6 years earlier. And this was part of the answer to this question. And it's really unfortunate not for Ukraine to hear these messages. We are really sorry for Georgia that came up to find itself in the circumstances that the highest official of Georgian government can make the statements like that. We stand with Georgian people. We know that still there is a huge room for transformation and for accelerating their European track. And
well, let me just ask you a question, and it involves the question about courage of convictions. In 2008, our then U.S. ambassador to Russia, Bill Burns, said that Ukrainian membership in NATO would become a neuralgic issue for Russia. And yet we opened the door for potential Ukraine membership. So that was a known issue. The question is whether or not the Georgian foreign minister was correct or not. Do you believe that those that wanted to embrace eventually Ukraine and NATO have done what they should in terms of that, knowing there would be a Russian reaction anyway? Even if it were true that aspiring to NATO would spark a war, who cares? Why? In other words, it's a gambit that matters. So I just want to say, have the West, have NATO nations, have the West done everything they should to have played out this gambit, knowing what Russia might do?
Absolutely not. So the inaction of NATO has even got a specific title called strategic ambiguity. So everybody have heard it around the globe. So inaction since 2008 brought us where we are, and the let's say hashtag of everything we're discussing now with our partners is learning by doing.
Right.
It's only by doing and taking actions we have learned how to be right, how to be strong, how to be resilient. By taking actions to advance military support through Ramstein, we have learned to be coordinated on military support, and it didn't affect anything. By being united, we have shown Russia failed to declare the goal of undermining the support to Ukraine. Russia has failed to reach any of the declared military goals by not knowing Ukrainians. So it's only by doing. And this doing in terms of Ukraine's membership to NATO has not been the case in terms of even membership action plan. And what we see now with the 2,000 plus kilometers of borders of NATO from Finland with Russia, we see no rhetorics from Russian Federation. And we should not really treat Russian statements and Russian declaration seriously as if they're talking on behalf of the Soviet Union since the Cold War time. It is not so. Ukraine made a huge favor to the whole world by marginalizing Russia itself. The Russian army, which is not the freaking second army in the world, we see it and we show it on a battlefield. Any statement from Putin has been failing to be materialized in everything he promised, and this is our job. And we should also treat Russia equally and not look back to our shoulder on their action, because we have to act for ourselves, for our security, for our defense.
Tobias, I'd love to get a chance from you. I know, I kind of have a slice of an understanding of what you think should happen in Vilnius and with NATO here, but I want you to grade, how, because this very interesting comment that Olha made that NATO nations have been derelict in their responsibilities around knowing this invasion was coming. Love to get your thoughts and reactions in that.
Well, firstly, can I say on this last day of this conference, what an incredible conference GlobeSec is turning out to be, bringing together the relevant stakeholders, given the challenges that we actually face. So congratulations to all those who are organizing this, and I hope, wish it every success. Absolutely critical. I'm pleased you raised Georgia, because that's the one shock of this conference. The one country that should understand what is going on in Ukraine should be Georgia, because Russia has taken a couple of chunks out of it. And yet here we have the Prime Minister of Georgia saying, actually watching which way the winds are going to go, and then blaming NATO for this invasion.
Is that sort of a Neville Chamberlain play?
No, it's worse than that, in the sense that Neville Chamberlain was never going to join in on side. What you see here is the Georgian Prime Minister looking to see which way the winds are going to go. But it's the coercive reach of Putin that I'm concerned about. And if he's doing it in Georgia, he'll be doing it in other countries as well. We need to remain resolute in our determination to support Ukraine, because Ukraine is just the battle. There is an ideological war that's taking place across Europe as to where we go from a security and economic perspective. And that's why we need to move beyond just the military capabilities. We've got this huge, great big counteroffensive that we know will take place. But let's brace ourselves. It won't just end with one counteroffensive. There'll be a series of counteroffensives to flush Russia out. And then comes to the question you say, quite rightly poised, which is what then happens to guarantee the securities in the long term. How can it be that we offer Ukraine membership of NATO in the future? When the weather is nice and calm, that's when you can join. Well, why don't we actually shorten that distance between that calm weather outlook to today by actually getting NATO to get itself off the fence? Because formally it's benched itself. And we know the reason why, because of Turkey and indeed Hungary as well. You need the coalition of the willing then to step out of the consensus that NATO is limited by, recognizing that the most formidable, potent military alliance the world has ever seen is sitting on its hands, and it needs to put this fire out and stand up to Russia.
Tobias, I don't know if there are mechanisms for expulsion from NATO, but are there any red lines Hungary and Turkey could go over that would trigger such a red? And because you talk about, basically to join NATO, it's got to be by unanimous consent of 31 member nations. And it's very hard for me to find the fair weather day that Hungary says yes. So what do you do with Hungary?
So this is the big question for Ukraine, because if Sweden can't get in, then there's absolutely zero chance of Ukraine ever entering for the longevity, as far as I can see. So you need a plan B. And I've advocated this again and again and again. The joint expeditionary forces for Poland and Ukraine, they should be invited to join at the Vilnius summit. This is a smaller, NATO light, if you like, and that can provide an element. Don't forget that if countries don't have a security blanket over them or the ability to actually protect themselves, as our world gets ever more dangerous, the likelihood is more people will reach for nuclear capability. That's what will happen. That's where our world is going. And just simply to protect themselves. Because what we saw is Russia invade another democratic state in Europe, and the rest of Europe sit on its hands. That's what happened. It took us a while to get the political courage to eventually slide main battle tanks across the table. And I'm pleased that Britain has advanced that, pushed that, that envelope as to what is the art of the possible. Getting those F-16s, nudging the Americans to do so. It's all come very, very late in the day.
Zigis, I haven't had much time to actually process what Ursula von der Leyen just said. So with all due respect to Madam President and whatnot, but if I were a fast action blogger, I would say, which I used to be, I would say Ursula von der Leyen just advocated turning Ukraine into Taiwan. Of providing, some security guarantees and bundling them. She did not mention membership in NATO. She did not she basically talked about the EU, but talked about bundling, offers of defense. In France, we're going to get to Benjamin in just a moment. But did that sound like to you that does Ukraine as a Taiwan that has ambiguous bundled security commitments, does that work?
Well, I respect a lot von der Leyen. We were on the first
but did she
train
get it wrong?
Together with Benjamin to Bucha with her.
Yeah. But did she get
and
it wrong?
She did it right with candidate status in EU. That was her fight. Berlin made that fight with himself, and she won it. She did something that NATO didn't. You promised membership 15 years ago, but the period after was something you did in Munich 38. Do you remember guarantees of Hitler? You remember Poland in 39? They also had some little guarantees. Did it work? Do you remember Budapest Memorandum? Oh, we remember it all. Minsk's, Yalta's, enough of Munich's, Yalta's, enough of lies, enough of appeasement. Because you are from America. If you go to Reagan Museum in LA, in 66, this great American hero wrote, appeasement leads to final defeat. So make the promise work. Tomorrow, I'm very happy. Chairs like me, representing Britain, United Kingdom, France, Germany, America, most important NATO countries, we will make a statement that it's enough. We have to move to full implementation of Bucharest because it kills gray zones. We created gray zones in Bucharest. We created ambiguity on their membership that attracts Putin to attack. We should stop with our policies of giving him veto power now, enlargement, because with Bucharest decision, well, actually, not implementing the decision, we say that Ukrainians are in the sphere of influence of Russians. Security guarantees means the same. The only security, lifelong security guarantee is NATO membership. Next year, it's celebrating 75 years. So stop lying to ourselves and actually be a bit more pragmatic. They are security providers.
So if you were a strategic advisor to Olha on how to get around the Turkey-Hungary problem, how would you do it?
Go to Senate, take 76 senators to your side. We did 99, and you have a win in Washington NATO Summit.
That's specific. Benjamin, I was just talking to, we've known each other for a long time, and I'm a big fan, so I'm biased in that. But you've been very, very outspoken in a way that many French politicians have not about Ukrainian security guarantees. I'd love you to share your views on what has to happen, but more importantly, how much of France is with you?
First, look, there's no question that there can be no peaceful and secure Europe without a fully sovereign, free and secure Ukraine. And I think that's something on which a lot of the French, a majority of the French population agrees, and a majority of Europeans agree. And as much as we can discuss maybe disagreements and divisions in Europe, the full story of this war a year and a half after the beginning of Russia's aggression on Ukraine has been not only transatlantic but also unity, European unity in supporting Ukraine. Now, look, first I want to say I completely agree with Tobias, because before even talking about security guarantees for Ukraine, let's make sure and let's give Ukrainians everything they need to succeed at their counteroffensive. You know, I've seen this long debate about F-16 to only after months of conversation go to the conclusion that we all knew was coming, which is that we agreed to send F-16, and now it takes months to train the pilots. So let's give everything Ukraine needs to reconquer their own territory. And then of course, after that, in the long run, the only way to ensure the strategic victory of Ukraine and the defeat of Russia is to make sure that Ukrainians are anchored into Euro-Atlantic institutions, European Union, and then yes, I think in the long run, NATO. I know there's the question of giving multilateral tangible security guarantees if we can't get across some of the oppositions within NATO. But look, what is the conclusion that we can draw from Bucharest in 2008? At the time, the debate and the concern from some countries was that inviting Georgia and Ukraine into NATO would be a provocation for Russia.
Right.
What are the two countries in
that
the
was
meantime?
That was a known issue.
That was the issue, right? That was raised. What's been the lesson that we can draw from Bucharest? The two countries that have been attacked by Russia since then are Georgia and Ukraine. Not inviting these countries into NATO has been seen as a provocation, an invitation for Russia for aggression. That's the lesson that we draw. And the countries that are into NATO benefit from deterrence from
So reflect on something that can be a little bit painful, but I want to make sure that we cover all views, because not everyone agrees with the four of you, and there is in the United States pushback, and I've watched repeatedly over the recent years how 25 to 30% of the American public, armed with a Twitter account and some passion, can create crazy outcomes. And so I'm not talking about a majority perspective. I think we make a mistake of not looking at the power of well-equipped and animated minorities in any of our countries. And there is a strong view in many countries that that Ukraine is not worth the effort, that Ukraine is the wrong battle, the wrong war, the wrong line. Now I disagree with that, but I want to ask you, how corrosive is that element in France, how corrosive it is in all of our governments, and what do you do with it? Because my sense is that that kind of populist dimension is something that's rising, and it's a factor.
Well, look, I mean, I've always been a supporter of European sovereignty. The idea that Europeans must take ownership for their own security alongside their American allies, but first they should take responsibility. You mentioned it. I mean, this aggression has nothing to do with Ukraine's bid for NATO.
Right.
I was on Maidan in 2014. What I saw were European flags. And European flags, and for the first time in history, we saw young people being shot at because they were brandishing European flags, which were the promise of a better future, a fight against corruption and democracy, and being closer to the West and to Europe. That gives us a responsibility as Europeans to support Ukrainians, to draw strong security guarantees and make sure that we accompany them in the long run within the European Union.
Right.
And then, I think, and the UK has been a good example on this on jets. I think the French have been a good example on this on the light tanks.
Right.
I think Europeans can actually push Americans into getting more involved. I think we don't have to wait for the US to take initiative. I think actually we can be a little forward-leaning on this.
Olha?
Yeah, all of this discussion, have been taking place and all about this NATO and whether it was Russia or not Russia. I want to bring a bit of different angle to that. Speaking about the price, all of you states benefit from Ukraine, from our experience on a battlefield, from our experience in fighting this aggression, from our experience with Russians, you become stronger. Something Macron was talking about, strategic autonomy, seemed to be a Macron's dream, which would never take place. Look, we made it reality. EU has become a player on defense policy across the EU. The military support to Ukraine, European Peace Facility, joint defense procurement, this is what is built on our blood. This is important. This is our security guarantees, but this would never, ever, ever happen without Ukraine. Then Western Balkans, who finally turned the enlargement toward from Brussels to their side. This was a taboo. And now, listen, France and other countries, they're talking that this is a positive narrative. The same for NATO. We are open in terms of access to our expertise, knowledge, the experience we built, and NATO benefits from that. Allies benefit from that. Allies have a close meeting with no Ukraine invited, but information from Ukraine is taken. So it's not only that we're paying by our blood for our choice, it's also something that makes whole Europe, whole democratic world stronger, more resilient, more efficient, and brings us to those historical decisions which would never ever happen without this war. And that has a price. And this has a price. Otherwise, we've been instrumentalized as well as Russians do with us.
Sure, Zygis, I want you to respond, but I also want you to respond to this question that's come in. Security guarantees only after the war ceases? Why not shape and apply them now? Which I think that you have views on.
This little world after makes me crazy. And I want just to come back again what Benjamin, very crazy, what Benjamin said just recently. Non-enlargement of NATO provoked the war. So if we know it, if we know that enlargement is the end game strategy, we have a plan like that would consolidate the peace, that will build Europe whole and free, that our grandfathers wanted. Yes, this is chance for Europeans, because do we really want another Afghanistan on our soil? Are we ready for this another defeat? Are Americans ready? So if not, if we want to stop the war, extend NATO membership now, because it's much more effective and it's even less costly than just supplying the weapons. Have a plan.
Well, let me ask you all a question, and Tobias, you jump in. But you know, one of the things that kind of haunts me about NATO is, we have President Macron arriving shortly, and his comments before the Russian invasion of Ukraine that NATO was brain dead, that NATO did not know what it was doing, it was floundering. And it took really an exogenous shock. It took the Russian invasion of Ukraine to remind NATO allies, to remind the transatlantic relationship why it was so fundamental. Now you can't find anyone to say, oh, the transatlantic relationship has never been stronger. But it's stronger because of an action that was taken, not because internally it was known and felt and revitalized. So is there an opportunity in this that we have to grab now to make that relationship mean something for the next 100 years that it was lacking before this invasion? Because I know it's an odd question, but I think you're in pretty bad shape if you have to depend upon your enemy to find your purpose.
Yeah, I think firstly, going back to the original point about, this panel is so, I think, different from other panels because we all face the electorate. So we're the ones that need to keep the message going as to why we are supporting Ukraine. It isn't simply just because a bully has invaded another country. It isn't simply just because ideologically, if Russia wins, it'll move on to other parts of Europe. It's also because it affects us. Our national security and our economic security are one and the same. Ukraine provides 10% of the world's barley, corn, and wheat. And that's had a knock-on consequence to European food prices. The reason why there's a cost of living crisis in the UK is because of Ukraine. If we get those grain ships out of Odessa, just 1/5 of those grain ships leave at the moment. If we change that, if we get a better movement of those ships, be able to feed not just Africa or Europe and so forth, it'll also help our own economies. We need to keep that messaging going. But I absolutely agree on the NATO front. How bizarre this is that we make this promise that you can come into our club, but only once you've sorted out your little thing that's going on there. Why not invest now? Get them to join NATO, or at least the Joint Expeditionary Force. But you have this problem that it's consensus driven. And that's the challenge that NATO then needs to get over, as to how you actually make that happen.
I want to get Ben in, but I also want to get Ivo because he's shaking his head and he knows about.
Can I,
yeah,
before
go ahead. Real quick, yeah.
defend the French and President Macron? To
defend
be
the French?
honestly, yes. It sounds surprising. Today, I feel much more united with my European continental brothers than with Washington itself. I want Biden to be a Reagan of, Eastern and Central Europe. And for some reason, that's his leadership that's needed right now. I have a more or less consensus on the Hill. I have more or less consensus in think tank community in Washington. And I have Biden coming to Vilnius in 2 months. And you know what's lacking? His leadership. Because if he today say that we are open for NATO, everybody agrees. He has a chance to become a legend. So he should grab that chance before it's not too late.
Ben? Benjamin?
Yeah, you were mentioning the brain dead comment that was from 2019, and I think President Macron's aim there was also to spur a debate and shake Europeans out of complacency. What was the context at the time with President Trump as President of the United States, which is something that could happen again next year? We had, at the time, a crisis in northeast Syria where the United States pulled out and Turkish troops entered, and we still have Turkey today that's blocking Sweden's accession into NATO. I hope that we can overcome this in the next few weeks. And had tensions with other NATO members threatening their maritime sovereignties like Greece or Cyprus. And I think that's probably what you will hear this afternoon coming from President Macron as well. There's always been a sense that, once again, we have our allies in the United States, but Europeans must take more ownership. Right now, today, in the French Parliament, we're debating a defense budget bill, which basically, if you take from 2017 to 2030, France will have doubled its military spending. And that's the same for UK, Poland, Germany, where we've seen also a major awakening. And I think that's the debate that he wanted to start. And of course, it's been made so much more urgent by the war.
Benjamin, let me ask you a question, and then I want to jump to Ivo. Many of us in this room go to conference after conference. They start in early May throughout Europe, and if you go in and find one pervasive view, it is thanks to the U.S. government for what it has done for Ukraine, dismay at the limits the National Security Council and White House seems to have put on doing more because of so-called fear of escalation, and that the White House may be just fine with a frozen conflict and coming. What is your, a lot of the same people I do, is that where our friends in the NSC are driving this, is to a frozen conflict?
Well, look, I mean, it might be. I don't want to necessarily speculate on this. I do want to give credit to the Biden administration. I mean, look, once again.
How much?
Look, I mean, I remember how worried I was on February 24th that we would lose focus after a month or two. That we would basically do the same thing we had done before, which is you have an instant moment of solidarity, it's shown in the media, you have some sanctions, and then we go back to normal. And then we push Ukrainians into capitulating, into negotiating. Ukrainians would have refused this, but we could have abandoned them. And I see, once again, a year and a half later, that not only are we still united, we're still discussing how we can get Ukraine into NATO, how we can get tangible security guarantees and more weapons into Ukraine, but because Tobias mentioned that we're politicians, our public opinion still care. You have 3 24-hour news channels in France. One of them has decided to devote all of its coverage to Ukraine. It's doing Ukraine from morning to night. You ask journalists, they all say the most read articles online are about Ukraine. And our public opinion is still aligned because, and actually sometimes more aligned than our elites, because they have the common sense of understanding that when you appease a bully, you invite more aggression. And so this makes me more optimistic, and I think the Biden administration, and I've been critical just 5 minutes ago when I said that we could have gone much quicker on the F-16, but I think it's done a good job at keeping transatlantic unity. I think everyone in this room would be on the side of going faster, quicker, doing more. But, I've been more critical of the US, including of this administration in different instances. I'm French after all. But I think on this, I think we can give them some credit.
Well, Ivo, I'd love you to come in not only with your comment or question, and we'll also include many others, but from your perspective, as you are as our ambassador to NATO, right? What would, is there any way for the U.S. to sign off on NATO membership, faster NATO membership, for a nation who does not right now control its borders?
So let me answer the question.
It's a binary. It's like a yes or no, right?
It's not, no, none of these issues are binary, which just makes it a little complicated. I want to make sort of two points. One, let's be very clear that nothing is preventing Lithuania, France, or the UK today from sending troops to Ukraine to help defend it. Article 51 under UN Charter holds the right for collective self-defense. Ukraine has asked for that help.
Right.
No one, not the United States, not Joe Biden, is telling you not to do that. We have all made a sovereign decision, for whatever political reasons and strategic reasons, to limit our willingness to help Ukraine to the provision of materiel, to the provision of people and intelligence. So with all due respect, let's be clear that if we wanted to help Ukraine win the war by sending troops, there's nothing to stop us, except that perhaps we have other interests that may prevent us from doing so, which is why we haven't done it under number one. So it's not just about let's make them members of NATO so that we can help come defend Ukraine. You can defend Ukraine today, number one. Number two, Biden hasn't led. The administration hasn't done anything. $70 billion of U.S. taxpayer money has been sent. How can you, what would Ukraine be able to do today without the military and intelligence and training support that the United States has provided? I mean, just the idea that we can sit here and say that the United States hasn't led, hasn't done its role, hasn't done what it needs to do, frankly, is over-the-top political rhetoric that is not particularly useful to get the United States.
But it is part of the conversation.
That's why I want to be part of the conversation. Good luck, by the way, getting the Germans to send Leopard tanks without the United States promising to do M1 Abrams tanks.
Right.
So just one way after the other. Good luck defending Kyiv
Right.
against long-range ballistic missiles
Right.
without Patriot systems.
Real
To your question, it is fundamentally difficult, not impossible, but difficult, to provide security guarantees, which means you will defend the country by sending your troops when that country has contested borders and is in the middle of a conflict. I don't think it's impossible. I don't think it's easy. I don't think you just vote on it and say, let's just do it. It is something that you need to analyze. So my sense is that we should come to Vilnius with a commitment to say, how do you do this? Where do you draw the line of an Article 5 guarantee?
Right.
Is it
Just so real
belong to
quick,
the
because you
1991
know these
borders?
folks, are they prepared to do that in
No,
Vilnius?
Not yet.
Yeah.
To be quite
You
frank,
mean you mean Ukrainians or
The Ukrainians are
Americans?
Americans.
We are.
Americans.
but the Americans are not yet prepared because in part they want to know that answer.
Are you giving them some advice on how to do it?
If I would, this is not the place where I would be providing it.
Tobias?
Yeah.
I mean, much food for thought there. The first thing is I've served in the armed forces in a number of NATO operations. None of them were members of NATO, but the decision was made because it was the right decision. You know, Kuwait was invaded, and therefore, because a state was invaded, then the world responded. Quite right. And the same with Ukraine. The thing about having the United States there is it provides mass and capability. What has been missing here, and we should not take away, quite rightly, the scale of support that America has provided, but it's the political appetite and the almost Chechenian leadership of wanting to step up and look Putin in the eye. And my concern throughout this entirety is that we've been spooked by the rhetoric that we hear from Putin. I was in Ukraine 4 days before the invasion, and I was calling, I didn't know when the invasion would take place, for a coalition to be moved instantaneously to provide the answers to Zelensky calling for support. 16 Air Assault Brigade, 82nd Airborne, these sort of things could have come in, which would have made Putin think twice. We blinked, and now we've got the consequences of it dragging out with these big discussions about how do we provide Ukraine with its security. We need to flush Russia out in its entirety from mainland Ukraine. The sooner we do that, the sooner it's easier to provide guarantees. I end with this final point. Ukraine doesn't need manpower.
Right.
They've got all the people they need. What they require is more Storm Shadow missiles, more F-16s. They require the equipment to be able to protect themselves. That's what they require.
But if we had a broadened circle here where we had the foreign minister of the UAE, of Brazil, and of India joining us. I'm interested in how the conversation would be different and why many people in this room have failed to square the deal and align perspectives regarding what you just said about Vladimir Putin. And I would love to hear from Žygis on that challenge, because there are big sections, high population nations in the world who aren't on board with this project. Now, they're not part of the NATO equation, but they are pathways of support for Russia and for a kind of different alignment, if you will. And does that worry you?
Well, if I would be American president, I would think, you know, yes, I'm the biggest democracy on this planet. And if I fail in Ukraine, and if I have another Afghanistan, China will probably make a wrong move in Indo-Pacific, and that might end American peace on this planet.
Right.
I would be really worried. So if I would be Biden, I would opt for my Truman moment, for my Churchill moment, but not for Chamberlain moment, not for Bucharest moment, because we cannot repeat another Bucharest. I would really love this president, who is a Cold War warrior, who was the senator who fought the war for our Lithuanian membership in NATO, together with Senator McCain. I want him to have this pivotal moment in Vilnius, because his window of opportunity is very narrow. He has elections, we have elections, and actually this is time to do it right. We have unity in Europe and in NATO like never before. I remember it maybe 2003, 2004, the most romantic period of our EU and in NATO enlargement. Look, EU and NATO enlargement is now in every debate. Don't you get it? Ukraine is in every debate. This is time to make it through. If he passes it, you know, legacy is done. And American presidents really take care of the legacy. So let's take care of the legacy of President Biden, because I like that president.
Olha, I'd love to have you respond, and then I'm going to go to this gentleman back here, but you know, we get taking questions as they come in.
I'll try to be really short.
Yeah, but one quick question I want you to ask, because you know, I think I want this person corrected. But it says, what would be a practical benefit of Ukraine being admitted to NATO, considering, this is not me saying this, that NATO already supplies huge amounts of Ukrainian arms as well as pays all Ukrainian bills? Now, I know that's not true of NATO. It may be helpful for NATO nations, but I would love you to provide any clarifying comments.
Yeah, I think it's perfectly matching with my comment I wanted to do on the ambassador's speech. So it's like perfectly American approach. This is how.
What Ivo just said?
Yes. Yeah. So it's absolutely vital. We're talking about survival as a nation, as a country, as a people. We're fighting for our lives, fighting for our country, and the role U.S. played here on mobilizing like 40 plus countries on military support and coordination is a historical decision. And but I would not agree on a number of things. So U.S. leadership is also a leadership by choice. All other allies are ready to stand collectively with NATO to share this burden. But U.S. leadership is important. It's overtaken. We're taking these conditions. They're vital for our economy, vital for our support, vital for coordination. This is decision which has been taken for Ukraine to prevail on the battlefield, for Ukraine to survive. We are here because all of it has been done. We're talking about what comes next. But for what comes next, it's already not enough. It is enough to survive. It's enough to prevail. It's enough to have a successful counteroffensive. It's enough for all of us keep on running on the wheels we are running. But it's not enough for the victory. And what we are talking about is the will to outsource all of it to NATO. And it is the option. It is the option, and that's what we're talking about. And we're talking about the country that everything a part of restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. You can name it anyhow. It could be ceasefire, it could be a political negotiations, it could be like non-NATO enlargement stuff. But everything a part of that would mean a very simple thing in a historic perspective. We should not really be in emotions like that. It would be playing on a Russian playbook. whatever it means, it will be another ministry, it will be the exhausting war they are working on, it would be everything which would not lead to restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity, security guarantees, Ukraine's membership to NATO, would mean that we play the Russian narrative. We make the price of their war cheaper, we make them unpunished, and that's something we should bear in mind every time. So praise, God bless America for everything which has been done. Our patriots have, it's our patriots, we call it our patriots. They saved the lives of Ukrainians. We are alive, and I am alive from Kiev because of the support you made us, but we need more.
Thank you, Benjamin. I know you want to respond, but when you respond too, I've got another question here, and then I'm going to go to this gentleman back here. So the two key nations that blocked the NATO membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine were France and Germany. Have they learned their lesson?
Right. Well, first, let me pick up quickly on the question you asked earlier about what we call the global south, right? Because we've seen this. I mean, in Hiroshima recently, President Lula didn't want to meet with President Zelensky. We've seen the
we saw him ignore him,
and we've seen how, you know, a country like India and others have been used by Russia to circumvent sanctions. Just want to make two quick comments on this. First one, I mean, of course, it shows that the West has lost a sort of monopoly over the rest of the world, and we have to understand this. We have to accept it, and it makes diplomacy more complex, and we have to integrate this into our worldview. And it does have an economic impact when Russia can go to different kind of partners to circumvent sanctions. However, I've seen sometimes a little bit in the commentary the idea that because other major countries don't support us in Africa or in India and China, it would sort of erode the legitimacy of what we're doing to support Ukraine. And I think we have to be comfortable.
Just to be clear, I'm not talking about legitimacy. I'm talking about efficaciousness.
Of course, on the question of effectiveness, that's a real issue. But sometimes, you know, I think it's fine. The fact that Europeans are starting to get a sense of strategic identity means also that they have to be comfortable with the idea that we don't necessarily represent, you know, universal interests or values. We have our own priorities, we have our own interests, we have our own security. When there's a war on our continent, it's normal that it's a major priority for us and affects us, and affects us more than would countries at the other side of the world, and we have to be comfortable with this. It's a little bit of a shift in mindset for us, especially since the end of the Cold War. We're not a major NGO defending global issues. We're a political entity, and we defend political interests and our continent, and trying to make our continent.
Why doesn't France send troops?
No, I agree with what Ivo said. I think the strategy that we've been following since the beginning of the war has been successful, which is basically we give everything Ukrainians need to defend themselves, and at the same time we don't get ourselves drawn into a direct confrontation with Russia, because we don't, you know, see there's a major risk of escalation linked to this. And it would be hypocritical if we said that we disagreed with this, because this is a strategy that every NATO country has decided to follow successfully. But once again, as I said, and to answer your question on France and Germany, I think clearly on the long run, and giving security guarantees, and which I would advocate would mean Ukraine into NATO, I think you have a shift here in how we build effective long-term deterrence, for sure.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Eugene Choli, Honorary Council of Ukraine in Montreal and President of NGO Ukraine 2015. Madam Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, you've said that strategic ambiguity has led to this genocidal war. All of the countries that are represented at this GlobeSec conference have agreed after the Second World War and signed on to or ratified the Convention Against Genocide under the slogan of never again. I think that although Ukraine is obviously very thankful to all of the countries that have helped, including the United States of America.
A few minutes, as you can tell from the clock, so real quick.
My real question to you is the following. I think one of the most frustrating parts from Ukraine is the fact that people do not realize that time is crucial. Today, as we discuss from one conference to another, Ukrainians are dying. Ukrainian women are being raped.
Okay,
and Ukrainian
I really
children
have to bring
are
it
killed.
to an end.
What is the most important things that need to be done in order to ensure a Ukrainian victory in 2023?
Thank you. We're going to go real short form because we have a few minutes and I want to get right here. Yes, go ahead.
Probably readiness for taking the actions. So the longer the war is lasting, the more time it takes to take any decision. So resolve for every politician around the globe should be as strong as every Ukrainian serviceman now in the Eastern and
Olha,
Western
within
front.
the European decision makers, who are the black hats that are in the way? I'm a writer. We like villains and heroes. Who are the
I
villains?
love my Euro-Atlantic part of mandate because it allows me not to speak anything of what I do. I think that it's not definitely a Hungary and Turkey.
Right. Who are the other villains?
If additionally to 16 members of of NATO alliance, 2 major ones, or at least 1 major one, would do a strong stand for Ukraine, it will work. And U.S. knows this role to play, and this card should be played. And I want to say that by the very issue raised by respective U.S. ambassador, NATO has already taken a major step towards to meet Russian expectations in terms of non-enlargement, non-engagement of NATO. All NATO allies, the ideology of the collective security, now willing to irritate Russia, has clearly said 30 NATO allies would not put its foot on Ukrainian soil. NATO would never participate in that war.
Right.
This is a step done to meet Russia, to open the negotiations. But this is not what should be done by allies when it's talking about membership of Ukraine, because it is a step for Ukraine. So step for Russia is done, step for Ukraine needed to be done.
So I'm going to take this 30-second question, and as we're going to go, I'm going to ask everyone as we go towards Vilnius, if there is a key thing that needs to happen to address Ukraine's long-term security in a constructive way, what has to happen in Vilnius for that to happen? So we're going to come back to you in just a moment. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. I'm Salome Samadashvili. I'm a member of parliament from Georgia, from opposition. And first of all, I want to say that the comments made by Georgian Prime Minister yesterday do not reflect the views of not only the democratic opposition, but the majority of the Georgian citizens. So, and I hope that the free and fair elections in my country next year will put Georgia back firmly on the Euro-Atlantic track. But what I want to say that for us, for Georgia, for Ukraine, Vilnius summit is crucial. Because one thing which will fuel the kind of propaganda, the Russian propaganda you heard from Georgia's prime minister yesterday, will be inability of the NATO allies to deliver substantial step forward for Ukraine and Georgia in Vilnius. So whatever will be the decision, it has to be a clear message that NATO membership for us is advancing, because that is what the citizens and their security need in my country as well as Ukraine.
Thank you so much for that intervention. Tobias, 30 seconds.
NATO, Vilnius, we need to give the logistics, give the equipment so Ukraine can complete their flushing out of Russia. We also need to recognize the bigger picture. Our world is getting more dangerous, not less. All NATO countries, as they regroup, and after the bruising of Afghanistan, need to move to at least 2.5% GDP. Otherwise, we will face, in the next couple of decades, our world splintering into 2 spheres of competing influence, and that will be very dangerous indeed. And then finally, the grain. Let's get the grain moving out of Odessa.
Thank you. Zygis.
After the war, I made 8 visits to Kiev with Benjamin and other politicians to unite the West on Ukraine. But you know what's ironic? In the last term, this will be my 5th visit to Washington right now. I will go together with my friend Alicia Kerens, chairman of Foreign Affairs Committee. And Brits are laughing at me, saying, Žygis, you feel like we felt in 40s when we've been asking Americans to do it. So my plea to America, don't wait for your Pearl Harbor. Do decisions in Vilnius. Invite Ukrainians.
You know the town well, so when you come back, give me a call. I'll give you a stage. It'll be fun. Benjamin.
No, look, on Vilnius, 3 things. On the long term, give a real path to Ukraine and be clear about this. Second, in the short term, what's more important, and then let's make sure that it stays in the long term, supply of weapons. You know, and by the way, security guarantees on paper, I mean, we all remember the Budapest Memorandum. Security guarantees on paper don't mean anything. Let's make sure that we have a steady defense support for Ukraine in the long run with military supplies. And then third thing, let's not forget Sweden into NATO.
Right. Thank you. Olha, I'm going to give you the last word.
Well, the major security guarantee is the advanced European defense industry. So most of our investments go to supporting European security and defense policy, advancing defense industry across the Europe. This does not something that does not depend from the political will and the bizarre discussion of the leaders. So we invest into that. We are really proud of President von der Leyen advancing that, and we are happy to back up French ideas with a real fuel. So this is a very pragmatical thing we're going to invest into. Secondly, membership to NATO. We have been the most experienced nation of the world in hearing and discussing no from NATO since 2008. Right. So we know if there's nothing to be started over Vilnius, nothing will be there for Washington next year. So towards the pathway towards Ukraine's membership to NATO now, and it's ultimate and it's not discussable. I just had a conversation with the president and I can confirm it, that it's a spirit right from the Kiev, and we cannot be resolved on a battlefield and we cannot be ambiguous on the political discussions. This is no way to go, because we fight for ourselves, we are resolved, but we know that something is at stake, is the Europe we're going to lead for and we're going to defend that. And NATO should shift the responsibility for European leaders as well, that it is about the security in Europe. So, and thirdly, let's keep in mind that we keep the country running throughout the war. We are fully operational. I represent a fully operational administration from Kiev. So the more opportunities we will be given to survive ourselves, the less financial support we would need. So security guarantees, European defense, membership to NATO, pass over the Vilnius are ultimate.
Well, I just want to thank all of you. And I'm going to just say in conclusion, our time is up, but what I would say in conclusion is it's very interesting if you think historically there aren't many playbooks for this kind of moment. And I was very taken by what you all said, but particularly by what Tobias said about the conversation that has to happen with citizens, because we have to face the fact that there are many, many people not sitting in the Globsec Bratislava Forum, or who are constantly reading about these affairs and who are struggling with the various challenges they have in their own lives. And they look at this as a remote and distant issue and not something that is existential. And that conversation is really, really important. I'm glad that all of you are doing it in your own countries. I want to thank everybody for coming and for the diversity of thought I thought we had. So please thank Olha, Stefanishyna, Pavilionis, Tobias, Ellwood, and Benjamin Haddad. Thank you all so much.